there have been more protests and violence in cities right across the US. President Trump has been criticised by some for telling state governors to take a much tougher line with the protesters. George Floyd's brother has told demonstrators that his family is peace-loving and that violence will not bring the changes that the black community needs. George Floyd died last Monday after being pinned to the ground by a white police officer. That officer has been sacked and is facing a charge of murder. By Friday, protests against police brutality had swept the US in cities including Oakland and Denver, New York and Los Angeles. And yesterday evening, curfews were largely ignored by many demonstrators in dozens of cities, and thousands of National Guard soldiers had been sent to 15 states and to the capital itself, Washington, D.C. Nearly 4,500 people have been arrested so far. A post-mortem, which was commissioned by the family of George Floyd, has found that he died of asphyxiation because of pressure on his back and neck. Well, for the latest in Minneapolis, let's join our correspondent there, Barbara Plett. Usher.
Hugh, we've been so fixated with the images of cities burning across America, but today it's important to remember that that started here. George Floyd was killed here, and people here are remembering that today.
7 days after the death of George Floyd, his brother returned to the place where he drew his last desperate breaths.
What's his name? George Floyd! What's his name? George Floyd!
This was more than a stop on a private journey of grief. It was an appeal to end the violence that exploded in protests over the brutality of his killing.
Let's stop thinking that our voice don't matter. That's right. And vote. Let's switch it up. Yes. Amen. Do this peacefully. Please.
No justice! No peace!
Protests the day before were largely peaceful, but as night fell, demonstrators defied orders to go home and promised to keep coming back.
Even if it ends out today, there's tomorrow. Understand that. You can't kill all 400,000 of us or 1 million of us. You can't do it in one whop.
Do you think these protests are different than others that have happened?
Yeah, because we tired. We tired.
The curfew has just ended and police are dispersing the protesters. They seem to have gained the upper hand now and they want to consolidate that control. It's been a week since George Floyd died, but it's going to take more than curfews and physical force to deal with the damage that was done.
Security forces have come down like a hammer here to restore order. But the case of George Floyd has refocused attention on the long-standing problem of police violence. Because of this graphic video, which showed Mr. Floyd expire in real time as he begged to be able to breathe. The officer pinned him to the ground with a knee to his neck for nearly 9 minutes. Derek Chauvin was charged with murder and manslaughter, but he already had a bad record, at least 17 misconduct complaints. An official autopsy said this wasn't the direct cause of Mr. Floyd's death, although Mr. Chauvin was charged with third-degree murder. An independent autopsy released today says otherwise.
The evidence is consistent with mechanical asphyxia as the cause of death and homicide as the manner of death.
The public fury has been punctuated by a rare show of solidarity from individual members of the security forces.
Shaking a hand.
Thank you.
Here, the National Guard, but police officers across the country have made similar gestures. No sign of reconciliation from the president, though.
Dominate. If you don't dominate, you're wasting your time. They're going to run over you. You're going to look like a punching jerk.
The president spoke after a weekend of chaos across the country. He's literally under siege, with protesters chanting at the doorstep of the White House and setting fires in the Capitol. In San Diego, more than 100 were arrested as police moved in with tear gas. And in New York, a curfew has been imposed tonight after police fought running battles with protesters. Today was a moment of reflection in Minneapolis, where it all started. People feel like they've been here many times before, outrage over a brutal death that didn't lead to change. But they're wondering whether, just maybe, this time it might.
They do think it's different this time, Hugh, because of the way it's gone national. But I don't think anybody expects change to come without more violence because of the protester, but also because of the hard line coming out of the White House.
Barbara, many thanks again. Barbara Plett, Usher, at the scene there in Minneapolis for us. And we'll stay with the story because there's broad agreement, of course, that America has not witnessed racial unrest on this scale since the late 1960s, following the assassination then of Martin Luther King. The circumstances in which George Floyd died and the highly charged response have illustrated once again the deep mistrust and the hostility felt by millions of African Americans towards the police. Our correspondent Nick Bryant puts the events of the past week into a wider historical context.
The words state of emergency seem inadequate to describe what's happening in America right now. And not since the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968 have we witnessed such widespread racial turbulence. If we rendered these pictures in black and white, they'd look like they came from the 60s. That was the decade when the struggle for black equality achieved such landmark success. The civil rights movement pushing for legislation that ended segregation across the American South and guaranteeing voting rights for black Americans. But there was unfinished business. Police brutality has always been hard to legislate against. African Americans have never achieved equality in pay, a form of income segregation that persists today.
The racism is a sword that has been festering for over and over and over again. And it's like when the sore is about to heal, the wound is reopened again by incidents like this. And you have to start all over again. And the question is, how much can people take?
Many hope the election of America's first black president would repair, even heal America's racial breach. But Barack Obama never wanted his time in office to be defined by the color of his skin. In terms of racial progress, his presidency was less historic than the fact that he became president.
This American carnage stops right here and stops right now.
He was followed into office by Donald Trump, whose political rise started when he disputed whether Barack Obama was born in America, a groundless accusation. Many reasons explain his victory in 2016, but Mr. Trump certainly benefited from a backlash against a black president among some white voters. America is being hit right now by three simultaneous convulsions: a pandemic that's disproportionately affecting people of color, an economic shock that's disproportionately affecting people of color, and civil unrest caused by police brutality that disproportionately affects people of color. Racial division is America's default setting, so what we're seeing here is not some aberration, but rather the continuation of an unbroken historical thread. Nick Bryant, BBC News, New York.
So let's go live to the White House. Our correspondent there is Aleem Maqbool. Aleem, we have the Floyd family calling for calm. We have the president calling for a tougher crackdown. What do you think the next few days hold?
More chaos, I'm afraid. Arguably the most violent scenes in the country. We're here in DC, actually pretty much on the spot where I'm standing 24 hours ago. And if the accusation leveled against police across this country is that they've been unable to de-escalate tensions, well, that same accusation has been leveled against the man in the building behind me. What people who've been coming here today and yesterday have been telling us is, yes, they are protesting the death of George Floyd, but they're also here specifically at the White House because they want to know that the president is listening to their grievances, their hurt, their pain over discrimination they've faced over generations. Instead, what they're getting is a president who's labeled them all as rioters and looters, who's told the police they can be even tougher, and that is why there are now real fears of even more violent interactions, potentially even deaths here or in other parts of the country.
Aleem, many thanks again. Aleem Maqbool, our correspondent at the White House.